So, there's this guy, let's call him James. He's in his early 30s, a bit of a quiet, laid-back type, but not the kind of guy who'd ever let things slide if they weren't right. And then, of course, there's his brother-in-law, Mike, who's about a year older, maybe 34, and honestly, he's the kind of guy you wouldn't look twice at until something about him makes you realize, yeah, he's probably up to something. James and Mike weren't exactly best friends. They were family, sure, but like most families, there was a bit of tension here and there. They'd hang out at gatherings, share a beer now and then, but there was always this kind of uncomfortable distance between them. James knew Mike had a few quirks, but he didn't think too much of it. That is, until one random Saturday afternoon when everything flipped on its head. You see, James was over at his sister's house, just hanging out, chatting about life, and trying not to get too caught up in all the weird little dramas that were always floating around the family. It was supposed to be a relaxing day. But then Mike, who'd been acting a little off all afternoon, slid into the room with an odd request. He needed something from James. Something personal. "Hey, man, can you help me out?" Mike asked, almost too casually, leaning against the doorframe like this was just any normal conversation. James, half worried it was going to be another one of those I'm down on my luck moments, turned his head from his phone and raised an eyebrow. "What's up?" Mike hesitated, just for a second, but then it was like the mask dropped. He wasn't his usual carefree self anymore. His voice lowered just a notch, like he was about to say something important. "Look, I'm having trouble with insurance stuff for Sarah," Mike admitted. Sarah, his wife, had been dealing with some health issues recently, and the whole insurance maze was driving them both crazy. "I was wondering if you could let me borrow your medical insurance details just for a little while. It's just for a checkup, man. Nothing major." James blinked, unsure of whether he was hearing this right. Of course, he wanted to help his sister and her family, but this was crossing a line. He'd never given his insurance info to anyone before, and the thought of it made his stomach turn a little. But Mike looked so desperate, so lost. Maybe he was just stressed out, trying to figure out a way to help Sarah without all the red tape. "You sure this is legit, Mike?" James asked, keeping his tone even, trying to let his suspicions filter through. "Because I've got a lot of personal stuff tied to that info. It's not just a quick thing to hand over." Mike waved him off, too quickly. "It's just a one-time thing, man. You won't even notice it. Trust me, nothing's going to happen." James was still hesitant. But then, seeing the look on his brother-in-law's face, the exhaustion mixed with a hint of vulnerability, he cracked. He thought it would be okay, just a harmless favor. So, he handed over the information, reluctantly, but it was done. And that was the beginning of the end. It didn't take long for things to spiral. A few weeks went by without much happening, and James had almost forgotten about the whole thing, until the first weird charge showed up. Then another. And another. Medical bills, treatment fees, the kinds of things he knew he had never seen before, suddenly piled into his inbox. James figured it was some kind of mistake, maybe a clerical error or a glitch in the system. But when he called the insurance company to get answers, what he heard sent a chill down his spine. "Sir, your medical records indicate a significant number of claims for procedures that you've never authorized," the representative said, voice professional but with a slight edge, as though something was off. "Can you confirm if you've used your medical insurance recently for non-personal procedures?" James felt his heart stop. The details that followed were like a slow-motion car crash. The bills had been racked up for things that were definitely not his treatments. But they were under his name, his insurance. Someone had been using his details. And the more he heard, the more his suspicion grew. There was only one person who could have done this. His stomach turned. "Mike." He must have used his info for more than just Sarah's checkup. But how far had it gone? What had they done with his insurance? And worse yet, if he didn't act fast, he could be on the hook for something way bigger than just a few medical bills. The moment James hung up the phone with the insurance company, everything around him seemed to blur. It was as if the world had paused, just for a split second, to let him process the tidal wave of what was happening. He didn't know whether to be furious, worried, or completely freaked out. Fraud? Fraud was the last thing he'd ever imagined when he handed over his insurance details to Mike. It was supposed to be a simple favor, a way to help family through a tough time. But now? He felt his chest tighten, a pressure building as he sat at his kitchen table, staring at the phone screen. His mind raced. The charges were big. The treatments, the kinds of things he'd never needed, and definitely never signed off on. Whoever had been using his medical insurance wasn't just getting a one-off checkup, they were racking up bills like it was nothing. His stomach twisted. The real kicker was when the representative had told him that some of the claims were labeled as surgical procedures. James knew, without a doubt, that he hadn't undergone anything like that. Not even close. The worst part? The longer this dragged on, the deeper the hole he'd find himself in. Mike had crossed a line. And now James was stuck in the middle of a mess that didn't even feel real. But it wasn't like he could just march over to Mike's and demand answers. No, that would have been way too simple. It was clear that Mike wasn't going to own up to anything without a fight. So, James did what anyone would do in a panic. He started digging. First, he called the insurance company back. Again. And again. Each time, his stomach sank a little further as he heard more about what had been going on. The claims weren't even for something minor, they were for huge treatments that he would have noticed if they were his. But someone had gotten their hands on his info, and it was a mess now. James knew the longer this went on, the more suspicious the insurance company was going to get. If they started investigating the fraud, he'd be dragged into it. It could be a nightmare. He didn't want to imagine the kind of legal trouble he'd be facing, the way they'd drag him into court, accusing him of something he didn't even do. The thought of it made his palms sweat. But there was something else eating away at him, Mike. His brother-in-law had always been a bit of a wild card, sure. But fraud? Seriously? James couldn't wrap his head around it. How far had Mike gone with this? And why? Was it just about saving his wife? Or was there something darker going on? Was Mike so desperate, so far gone in his own mess, that he was willing to drag James down with him? The more he thought about it, the more it made him furious. But even that fury wasn't enough to break through the panic. The idea that he might be implicated in this whole thing was more than unsettling. He had no criminal record. No history of fraud. He was just a guy, trying to help his family. But now he was stuck in the middle of something that had all the markings of a disaster. So, James did what anyone would do when they felt completely out of their depth. He confronted Mike. At first, Mike acted like everything was fine. He seemed totally oblivious to the storm that had already started to brew around them. He was sitting there on the couch, just watching TV like it was a normal day, when James walked in, practically vibrating with tension. The air in the room was thick, uncomfortable. There was a moment where neither of them spoke. James could feel his heart thumping in his chest. "Mike," James started, his voice trying to stay steady, but there was a tremor in it he couldn't hide. "We need to talk about something." Mike looked at him, blinking like he hadn't just dropped his entire life into James' lap. "What's up?" he asked, a little too casually, like this wasn't about to turn into a huge confrontation. James clenched his fists, trying not to lose control. "I know what you did. With my insurance." The words came out colder than he intended, and for a split second, he saw the way Mike's expression flickered, just a tiny shift. But it was enough. Mike's face dropped, like the whole facade cracked in an instant. He stood up slowly, his eyes darting around the room, not meeting James's gaze. "Look, man," Mike started, his voice low and hurried. "It wasn't supposed to be like this." James wasn't buying it. Not now, not after everything he'd learned. "What the hell does that even mean?" "You stole my medical insurance info, Mike. You've been using it to run up bills that I didn't approve. How far did you think this would go? How long were you planning on getting away with it?" Mike opened his mouth, then closed it. He seemed to be fighting for words, trying to come up with an explanation that wasn't just pure garbage. But James could already tell. This wasn't just some mistake. This wasn't a one-off issue. This was something deeper. Something more dangerous than Mike was ready to admit. And that's when the truth hit James like a punch to the gut. Mike wasn't going to come clean. Not fully. Not unless he had to. Whatever mess Mike had gotten himself into, it wasn't just about Sarah's medical issues anymore. This was about saving himself, about covering his tracks before things went completely sideways. James had to make a choice, and it wasn't going to be an easy one. He couldn't just let this slide. But confronting Mike wasn't the end of it. Not by a long shot. James didn't sleep that night. The whole house felt off, like it was holding its breath, waiting for the other shoe to drop. His mind wouldn't shut off. Every time he closed his eyes, all he could see were those damn medical bills stacking up in his inbox, the massive claims, surgeries, treatments, everything that wasn't his. It didn't make sense. Mike, his brother-in-law, wasn't stupid. He had to have known how bad this could get. So why the hell did he do it? By morning, James had made up his mind. He wasn't just going to let this slide. He couldn't. It was bigger than a family feud now. It was about clearing his name and getting the truth out before it all turned into a nightmare. He pulled out his phone, fingers shaking just a little as he dialed the number of his lawyer. He didn't have much time before this whole thing spiraled beyond repair. The insurance company was already suspicious. If they started digging too deep, who knew what they'd find? "Hey, James." "What's up?" The lawyer's voice was calm, professional, but something in the tone told James that the conversation wasn't going to be a casual one. "I need help," James blurted out, the words coming out in a rush. "Someone's using my insurance for fraud. And I think I know who it is." His lawyer was quiet for a moment. James could practically hear the gears turning on the other end of the line. "Okay, slow down. Start from the beginning." So, James told him everything. The details about Mike's weird request, the charges that started showing up on his medical bills, the way he felt like something just wasn't adding up. When he finished, the lawyer didn't immediately reassure him or brush it off. Instead, he said something that made James' stomach sink even further. "You've got to understand, James, this is serious. Insurance fraud isn't a small issue. If this gets out of hand, it could lead to criminal charges, and not just for Mike. You might get dragged into it, too." James felt his throat tighten. "I didn't do anything wrong. I just lent him my info to help with Sarah's medical bills. That's it." "Doesn't matter," the lawyer replied bluntly. "You were the one who authorized the use of your info. If it was used for anything else, you're still involved, whether you knew about it or not." The weight of the words hit him like a truck. He wasn't just some innocent bystander in all of this. No, his name was tied to the fraud now, and he needed to act fast. The lawyer promised to look into things and told James to stay calm and avoid making any rash moves. But that didn't make James feel any better. The sinking feeling in his gut just wouldn't go away. As the day went on, James couldn't get Mike out of his head. He tried calling him a few times, but Mike wouldn't pick up. James left messages, asking him to talk, to explain what was going on. But Mike never called back. It was like he'd gone into hiding, and that only made James more paranoid. By the time evening rolled around, James couldn't take it anymore. He had to see Mike in person. He had to confront him, lay it all out on the table, and get some kind of answer before things went too far. The drive to Mike's place felt longer than usual, the silence in his car deafening. Every red light felt like a countdown, like the universe was giving him a little extra time to brace himself. When he finally arrived, he parked outside Mike's house and sat for a moment, staring at the front door. He was so angry, so confused, but most of all, he was scared. What if Mike turned on him? What if he just denied everything and let James take the fall? What if he was in deeper than James could even imagine? Shaking off the thoughts, James got out of the car and made his way up the steps. He rang the doorbell, and when Mike's wife, Sarah, answered, she looked surprised to see him. "Hey, James, what's going on?" Sarah asked, her voice light but with a touch of concern. "I need to talk to Mike," James replied, trying to keep his voice steady, though he could feel the tension in his body. "It's important." Sarah hesitated for a second, then stepped aside to let him in. James felt a knot tighten in his stomach as he stepped into the living room. Mike was sitting on the couch, looking relaxed, too relaxed for someone who was about to have his life turned upside down. "James," Mike greeted him with a grin, but it didn't reach his eyes. "What's up, man? Everything okay?" James didn't bother with small talk. He went straight for the jugular. "I know what you've been doing, Mike. I know about the medical insurance. The bills. The fraud." Mike's expression flickered for a moment, then he laughed nervously, but it wasn't convincing. "Come on, man. You don't know what you're talking about." James wasn't buying it. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest. "Don't play dumb. The insurance company is already onto us. I've been getting charged for things I didn't even approve. This isn't just some misunderstanding, Mike. This is fraud. And you've dragged me into it." Mike stood up, his face darkening. "You don't get it, do you?" he snapped. "I had no choice. Sarah's treatment was getting too expensive, and the insurance company wasn't covering anything. You don't know what it's like to watch someone you love go through hell and not be able to do anything about it." James took a step back, the words stinging more than he expected. He hadn't thought about it that way, but it didn't change the fact that Mike had made a huge mistake. "I get it, Mike. But you can't just steal from me to fix your problems. That's not how this works. You've put both of us in danger. Now we're both screwed." Mike's face twisted in frustration. "You think I wanted this? You think I wanted to get us both caught up in this mess?" He was pacing now, his hands flying in the air as if he were trying to explain something impossible. "I didn't have a choice." But James wasn't listening anymore. His anger had reached its peak. It wasn't just about the fraud anymore, it was about everything. The lies. The manipulation. The fact that Mike had dragged him into a situation that could destroy both of them. "You had a choice, Mike," James said, his voice low and deadly calm. "And now we have to deal with the consequences." There was no going back now. James felt like his chest was going to explode. His heart was racing, his mind spinning in circles as he stared down Mike. The air between them was thick, heavy with the tension of a situation that was now far beyond just a bad decision. This was a mess, a complete disaster. Mike, pacing back and forth like a caged animal, seemed to be unraveling before James' eyes. His words came in quick bursts, too fast for James to keep up with. "I didn't mean for it to go this far, okay? You have no idea what it's been like. Sarah, she's been sick for months, and we just couldn't get the help we needed. It's like, the more I tried to fix things, the worse they got. I never thought this would happen, never thought it'd blow up like this. I was just trying to protect her. James stood there, watching Mike, the anger slowly giving way to disbelief. He never expected to hear that. Not from Mike, not in a million years. The guy had always been careless, but now he sounded like someone who had really been backed into a corner. Still, James couldn't shake the fact that his brother-in-law had dragged him into this nightmare. "You're trying to make me feel bad for you?" James snapped, voice rising. "You think that makes it okay? You put my name on the line, Mike. You've put both of us in danger. What if they trace this back to me? What do I tell my boss? My friends? Hell, the police? Oh, sorry, officer. My brother-in-law stole my insurance info because his wife was sick? Does that make any sense to you?" Mike froze for a second, the realization of the consequences finally settling on his face. The anger James felt wasn't just about the betrayal anymore. It was about the feeling of being completely powerless, caught up in something that had spun out of his control. Mike had made a choice, a terrible one, but now it wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who could be affected by his actions. And that thought hit James hard. Mike's eyes dropped to the floor, his hands running through his hair like he was trying to pull himself together. I didn't know what else to do. I thought I could fix it all without anyone knowing. That I could help her get better, you know? Without all the red tape. James closed his eyes for a second, forcing himself to take a deep breath. He knew what Mike was saying. He knew that desperation sometimes made people do crazy things. But this wasn't just about desperation anymore. This was a fraud investigation. And if the insurance company decided to press charges, the consequences would be massive. There was no pretending this wasn't a big deal. "I get it," James muttered, his tone softer now, but his anger still simmering. "I get that you were trying to help. But you can't just break the law to do it. Now we have to deal with this, Mike. There's no turning back." For a second, Mike stood still, almost like he was accepting the reality of what he'd done. But then, almost as if a switch had been flipped, he straightened up, eyes hardening. "You think I'm going down alone in this? You think I'm going to take the fall for all of it while you walk away clean?" His voice was low, cold. "We're both in this, James. You gave me the info. You're just as guilty as I am. So don't stand there judging me." James felt a chill run through him. Mike's words cut deep, even if he was still in denial. "What the hell are you talking about?" James shot back, voice sharp. "I didn't sign up for any of this. I didn't ask for you to steal my personal information, Mike. I didn't make the choice to commit fraud." Mike's jaw tightened, and for a moment, James thought the confrontation might turn physical. But then Mike just let out a frustrated growl and stormed toward the door, shoving past James. "Then what do you want me to do, huh? What's your great plan, James?" Mike snapped, spinning back around, hands raised in a defensive stance. "You think I'm just going to sit here and let the cops come after me? I'm not going down without a fight. You think this is all on me, but guess what? We're both screwed." The silence between them stretched out, thick and suffocating. James opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. For the first time in a long while, he didn't know what to say. What could he say? They were both in it now. They couldn't undo what had been done. They couldn't take back the fraud, the stolen information, the mess they'd both created. But James wasn't going to back down either. "Not now." "I don't know what your plan is, Mike," James said slowly, his voice controlled, steady. "But I'm not letting you drag me down with you. If you think you're going to weasel your way out of this, you're wrong. You're not getting off that easy." Mike didn't answer right away. Instead, he just stared at James, eyes narrowing like he was sizing him up. Then, after what felt like an eternity, Mike dropped his gaze and turned toward the door. "I don't need your help," he muttered, his voice low and defeated. "I'll figure this out on my own." But James wasn't ready to give up just yet. "We need to fix this, Mike." "Together," he said, his voice firm now. "We need to go to the insurance company, come clean, and hope for the best. If we don't do it now, they'll come after us both." Mike hesitated, then let out a long breath, his shoulders slumping. "You really think they'll let us off the hook if we do that?" "I don't know," James admitted. "But it's the only shot we've got." For a moment, neither of them said anything. But finally, Mike nodded, his expression dark but resigned. "All right. Let's do it. But if we're going down together." And just like that, James knew. This was it. The moment where everything was on the line. Whatever happened next, there was no going back. They had to face the consequences, together. James sat in the waiting room, his fingers drumming on the edge of the table, his stomach twisted into knots. It had been 2 days since he and Mike had made that decision, to come clean, to go to the insurance company together. He'd barely slept since. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was all just the beginning of a storm, and they were still in the eye of it. Mike had called him that morning, his voice sounding a little more resigned than it had during their last heated conversation. It was clear he wasn't exactly excited about the idea of facing the music, but there was no turning back. The appointment had been set. They were about to walk into the lion's den, and all they could do now was hope that the insurance company would show them some mercy. They'd come up with a story, sort of, a half-truth, really. They were going to explain that Mike had acted out of desperation, that he never meant to cause harm, and that everything had gotten out of hand before they realized the full extent of it. Still, it didn't feel like enough. No matter how many times James told himself that this was the right thing to do, the nagging doubt kept crawling under his skin. What if it wasn't enough? What if, in the end, they both went down for it? The door opened, and the receptionist called their names. James could feel the weight of her eyes on him as she handed them a clipboard, her expression unreadable. Mike walked ahead of him, his shoulders tense. He wasn't exactly eager to face the consequences either, but James could see the resignation in his eyes now. It was like all the fight had gone out of him. They were led into a small conference room, the kind where people sat across from each other at a polished wooden table, pretending to be civil while things like insurance fraud were hashed out. The agent who greeted them was middle-aged, wearing a suit that didn't quite fit the casual vibe of the office. She introduced herself as Carol, and her tone was professional but warm enough to put them at ease, for about 2 seconds. "So, gentlemen," Carol began, sitting down across from them, folding her hands on the table. "I've gone over the details of your case. We've received the information, and I have to say, I'm concerned. You're both aware of the seriousness of the situation, correct?" James nodded, feeling his palms sweat. He was trying to stay calm, but the adrenaline was coursing through him. Mike didn't say anything, just looked at the table, probably wishing he could be anywhere but here. Carol continued, her voice steady. "I understand that you've come to us today to explain the circumstances, but I'm afraid the evidence we have is pretty damning. The claims made under your name, James, surgical procedures, diagnostic tests, treatments that were never authorized by you, this isn't something we can just overlook. Fraud is a criminal offense, and we take it very seriously." James swallowed hard. He knew this was coming, but hearing it out loud made it feel real. Like the ground was shifting beneath him. He glanced over at Mike, who finally spoke, his voice a little shakier than he probably wanted it to be. "We didn't mean for it to get this far," Mike said, his voice cracking slightly. "I was just trying to help Sarah. I was desperate, and I didn't know where else to turn." I thought maybe if I used James' info, we could get the treatment she needed without all the hassle. It was stupid. I see that now. But I never meant to hurt anyone. Not James, not anyone. Carol didn't flinch. She just nodded, taking notes as Mike spoke. I understand that you were trying to help your wife, she said. But this is a serious situation. You've made unauthorized claims, and now the company needs to decide what steps to take next. The silence in the room was deafening. James sat there, numb, waiting for the hammer to fall. This was it. The moment where they found out just how much trouble they were really in. After what felt like forever, Carol finally looked up from her notes. Here's what we're going to do, she said, leaning forward. I'm going to offer you both a chance to make things right. It's not going to be easy, and it's certainly not going to be a free pass, but if you cooperate fully, we might be able to minimize the damage. James and Mike exchanged a glance, unsure whether to feel relieved or even more stress. First, we'll need you to repay the amount that was fraudulently claimed, Carol continued, and we'll need a written statement from both of you explaining the situation. If you're willing to do that, and if there's no further evidence of malicious intent, we might be able to avoid a full investigation. We may still involve law enforcement, but we'll do everything in our power to keep this out of the courts. James let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. This wasn't exactly the clean slate they'd been hoping for, but it was something. It was a chance. A slim one, but a chance nonetheless. Mike didn't say anything for a moment, his hands clenched into fists on the table. But then he finally looked up at Carol, his voice tight. We'll do whatever it takes, he said. I'll pay back every penny. We'll make things right. Carol nodded. Good. That's the first step. But this won't be over quickly. You'll have to work with us every step of the way. And if you slip up again? James didn't need her to finish that sentence. The consequences of that were clear enough. The meeting wrapped up quickly after that, with Carol outlining the steps they needed to take, the paperwork to fill out, and the deadlines. James and Mike walked out of the office feeling, well, not great, but certainly lighter. It wasn't a win, not by a long shot. But they'd managed to avoid the worst-case scenario, for now. As they stepped into the parking lot, Mike turned to James, a tired smile on his face. I didn't think we'd make it out of there without handcuffs, he admitted. But I'm glad we're not completely screwed. James nodded, his head still spinning. Yeah. But we're not out of the woods yet. This is just the beginning. And as they got into their cars and drove off in opposite directions, James couldn't shake the feeling that things weren't quite over. Not by a long shot. But at least for now, they had a chance to make things right. And that, for the moment, was all he could hope for.